Last time we stopped at the moment when, after the fall of the third dynasty of Ur, Mesopotamia ceased to be a unified political space. The great state fragmented into smaller entities, and instead of stable authority, there once again emerged competition among cities, local rulers, and temporary alliances. In this situation, fragmentation quickly revealed its weakness. Individual centers could rise, but they lacked the resources to sustain their advantage for long. It is important to note that the process was no longer a disintegration into individual city-states, but rather a breakup into small, minor state formations. This leads to the idea that a large state is more capable of defending itself. A large state, understood as a period in which domination is the norm, has greater chances of crushing its opponents. This idea remains very close and particularly compelling after the capture of the city of Ur in 2002 BCE. A period known in historiography as the Old Babylonian period began in Mesopotamia. The beginning of this period was marked by deep political fragmentation. For nearly 2 centuries, during the so-called Isin-Larsa period, dozens of city-states, among the most influential of which were Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and Mari, engaged in continuous struggle for hegemony. None of them was able to unite the lands of Mesopotamia for long, which confirmed the weakness of divided rulers. It was precisely at this time that two powerful forces emerged in the northern part of the region, temporarily altering the balance of power. In northern Mesopotamia, around the city of Ashur, a distinctive state flourished known as the Old Assyrian Kingdom. Unlike its southern neighbors, its power was based not so much on military force. Indeed, it was hardly based on military force at all. At this stage, Assyria did not yet play the role it would assume after the Bronze Age collapse, when the famous, brutal Assyria would appear the one associated with things like ripping out nostrils and similar atrocities. That Assyria, the one everyone knows about, will be covered in the next videos. During this period, Assyrian merchants created an extensive network of trading colonies, Karum, in Anatolia, modern Turkey, the most famous of which was the colony in the city of Kanesh. They exported textiles and tin from Mesopotamia and brought back silver and copper from Anatolia. On the map, you can see the places where objects connected to Assyrian trade have been found. It is not a fact that Assyrians themselves reached all of these locations, but the goods of their trade did. This activity brought Ashur enormous profits, turning it into one of the wealthiest centers of the time. However, as a predominantly commercial state, Assyria did not seek major territorial conquests in the south. The situation changed dramatically with the rise to power of the ambitious Amorite chieftain Shamshi-Adad I, circa 1808 to 1776 BCE. He was not a native Assyrian, but taking advantage of internal conflicts, he captured Assur and made it part of his new state. Unlike the merchant rulers of Assur, Shamshi-Adad was a conqueror. He conquered vast territories in the north, including the powerful kingdom of Mari on the Euphrates River, and created the first unified state in the history of Upper Mesopotamia. Proclaiming himself king of the universe, he united under his rule the lands from the Zagros Mountains in the east to Syria in the west. To govern the empire, he installed his sons as viceroys in key cities, Ishmedagan in Ekalatum and Yazma-Adad in Mari. Shamshi-Adad's state was centralized and military-oriented. It became the hegemon of the Near East. However, as was often the case with states built on the personal charisma and conquests of a single ruler, Shamshi-Adad's empire proved short-lived. Immediately after his death, it collapsed. The subjugated peoples rebelled, and his sons were unable to hold on to power. The kingdom of Mari regained its independence, and local dynasties returned to power in Assur. The political map of Mesopotamia once again became a mosaic of several large city-states competing for domination. At the beginning of the 18th century BCE, the main powers were Larsa in the south, Eshnunna in the east, Mari in the west, and Assyria in the north. As mentioned in previous videos, the Amorites conquered the city of Babylon and established the first Amorite dynasty there, from which King Hammurabi would eventually emerge, for example. It is often said that the third time is the charm. On their third attempt to create a large, extensive state, the local population finally succeeded. It was precisely this third attempt, which would be known as Babylon, that proved to be the most successful. After it, the concept of a unified state would never disappear from this region, even when the area was later conquered by invaders from other regions. It would no longer disintegrate into separate cities. Here, the state would remain with us forever. In general, Babylon represents the peak of the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia. It is the pinnacle of this era. This is because the Amorite dynasty, which again arrived at some point and established its rule in Babylon, existed for a while on its own without any grand ambitions. But at some point, either King Hammurabi's father or grandfather began expanding the empire, an effort taken up by Hammurabi himself, who, like Sargon the Great, ruled for a very long time, perhaps up to 50 years. From Babylon, we have inherited not just basic sources like the economic records or similar documents we often mention. Crucially, we have received actual descriptions of events from Babylon. We have inherited the meaning behind what was happening, not just the events themselves. You see, it's not just knowing that an army went somewhere and destroyed something. From Babylon, we have descriptions of how doctors treated patients, descriptions of how to perform divination, descriptions of why laws are created. We don't just have a list of Hammurabi's laws. Why are his laws so famous? Because we know why they were created. We know what state ideology stood behind them. This is very important. And this is perhaps the first time we truly capture this level of understanding from that era. Nothing remains of the ancient Babylon that we will be talking about now. It drowned, it washed away. The city was destroyed, its ziggurats floated away. Generally, this is related to the peculiarities of its architecture. It is due to the fact that the rivers changed their courses and the Tigris and Euphrates now partially flow where cities used to be, and therefore they flooded them. There are ruins of New Babylon, but New Babylon is another 1,000 years later. That one has survived well and has been excavated thoroughly. But of the old one, of Hammurabi's Babylon, absolutely nothing is left. However, the state was so rich and interesting that, on the other hand, in many neighboring cities that survived, there is more than enough material about this era. Because, first of all, we know practically everything about Hammurabi, it is so well documented. And it's not just some brief note saying that in such and such a year, like in 1729 or 1792 or whatever, Hammurabi ascended to his throne. Nothing of the sort. Everything is described. The ritual of royal consecration is described. How was it done? Because there was, for example, a ritual humiliation of the king. So, when the king ascended to the throne, his priests ritually humiliated him in plain sight of everyone. They slapped him in the face, tore off his clothes, and rolled him in the mud. That is, they treated him basically like some sort of outcast. This was a specific ritual humiliation of the king, designed to show him, don't forget where you might end up someday. Please do not forget. And by the way, recalling those myths we talked about, remember what Enlil ordered Enki there, like swear that you won't tell anyone? And Enki actually outsmarted a more important god. He deceived him. So there's this idea that you can even outsmart or deceive your boss. And later, when all the gods got tired of one of the top gods, they also banded together and overthrew him. In general, in Babylonian myths, since all this Sumerian Akkadian mythology becomes Babylonian at this point, Because the Babylonians also reshape it in their own way. Because the Babylonians, again, do not forget that they are the incoming Amorite tribes, who of course adopted this culture, but still adapted it a bit in their own way. And so they have this recurring theme that the boss is, of course, the king and a god. And Hammurabi, of course, is depicted with horns, the horned crown of divinity. And there are no complaints about that. But nevertheless, if push comes to shove, he could end up right there in the mud, without clothes, completely humiliated. He shouldn't forget about that. At the same time, when he ascends to the throne, a ritual called Misharum is performed. This is forgiveness. All the debt slaves that existed are freed. That is, a mass amnesty for debt slaves. If you ended up in slavery by birth, or if you ended up in slavery because you were taken prisoner, you are not amnestied. But if you fell into slavery because of your debt, then when the new king Hammurabi arrives, you are freed from debt slavery. Furthermore, there are known cases of letters being sent saying, "Please help, I am being held in slavery against my will. I was supposed to receive an amnesty, but my master didn't grant it." In general, Hammurabi is a unique king, and many say there is an opinion. I probably don't really support it, but the opinion exists that Babylon became successful in many ways because Hammurabi had good micromanagement. Hammurabi ruled a large empire as if he were managing his own Babylon. That is, he solved issues on a micro level. A city, a request from another city, or even from some village could come to him saying, "Please, Hammurabi, help. Our flocks and sheep are dying from something, and these are state-owned, but we are being told to restore them at our own expense. What should we do?" And Hammurabi specifically tells his people to send additional livestock there to fix the situation. Or, for example, these tablets are sent directly to him. "Hammurabi, please help. My former master is holding me in slavery against my will." He sends an order to remove him. He knows that in some district, for instance, lands are abandoned. Everything I'm saying right now is not a made-up example. I am listing things that are specifically found in the tablets, in the sources. Some lands are poorly cultivated, they are abandoned. He says, find out who owns them. Kick out the manager of those lands and replace him with someone who will manage them better, so that everyone works better there again. In general, the institution of leasing appears in the state under him. That is, under him, you can lease cows from the state. The cow is state-owned, the milk it gives is ours. If a calf is born, we will decide whose it is then. This classic institution appears under Hammurabi. Perhaps under his father, we don't know for sure. Hammurabi is not the first ruler of his dynasty, and he wasn't the one who started expanding the empire either. Therefore, maybe all this existed there before him or partially under him. But the point is, under him, all this was simply recorded, because it is under him that codes and laws are issued. Under him, many precedents and the source base from which we know all this are created. So maybe some of it existed before him. For example, he restores a massive number of canals that hadn't existed for centuries at that point. This is a renewed development of irrigation. They run canals further than they had ever been run before. What else is important? You can borrow from the state. For example, if you want to start a business, you can borrow measures of silver from the state, borrow measures of fabric, wool, and other things, borrow lapis lazuli, and so on. There were certain goods you could borrow to start trading, and at the same time, you had to return them. But return them at a huge interest rate. You borrowed everything at a 30% rate. At the same time, naturally, if you couldn't pay it back, you fell into debt slavery. And apparently, this was one of the ways to replenish the debt slaves who were amnestied when a new king came to power. We know about the army that existed under him because under his rule, the army is organized in the form of military settlements. That is, on the border with Elam, for example, a lot of military settlements appear. These are individual people, not a militia, not peasants. These are soldiers, but who themselves live on the land. They are given land on the border, and you are sent there. Generally, for most of the year, you are busy cultivating your own land. But as soon as a war starts, you drop the farming, and your task is to show up with weapons in hand and fight. So it's a sort of semi-professional army. On one hand, it's not exactly a militia drawn from peasants. On the other hand, it's not quite soldiers who do absolutely nothing else besides war. It's an intermediate option, and the entire territory along the borders is enclosed by these military settlements. Basically, at any one time, Hammurabi did not gather more than 2,000 men, meaning at some point he marched out, and an army of about 2,000 men was enough for him. At the same time, they begin to use bows under his rule. They are apparently being imported from Anatolia, from somewhere around where the Hittites will soon appear. And from there, apparently, bows start arriving. Because bows appear in the army, and this, of course, for this region where there was never any wood from which to make bows, is a super weapon. Because, wow, if earlier only some super elites had bows, now bows are starting to be used. And that's very cool. Oh, Dini. Naturally, he is included in the pantheon. Naturally, children are named after him, for example. We come across such names. Well, that is, the names of gods are found in children's names very often. In general, Babylonian names are very often a god and some prefix, like I am the friend of such and such a god, or praying to such and such. Yes, so we have the name Hammurabi Ili, meaning my god is Hammurabi. Well, it's like now, whoever our ruler is, like President Trump. Imagine someone being named my god Trump, for example, in honor of the ruler. And this is a side effect of the fact that the current ruler is also a deity. Temples are built in his honor. There is a personal cult of him that is maintained. A rather large lunar calendar is created. Moreover, the calendar is created in such a way, since astronomy in Mesopotamia was doing well. The calendar establishes a 19-year cycle. Within this, there are 12 years of 12 months and another 7 years of 13 months. That is, since it's a lunar calendar, the lunar cycle is shorter than a solar month. A lunar month is 20-something days anyway, less than 30. Because an extra month accumulates there, meaning 12 years of 12 months and another 7 years of 13 months. And in this way, in principle, this lunar calendar works like a solar one in terms of cycles. That is, it aligns perfectly over the years. And of course, it's probably time to move on to the most important thing. These are the laws. Everyone knows the Code of Hammurabi. This is probably the most important thing that happened because Hammurabi made it his ideology. Hammurabi thought, since I am a god, and after all deities are responsible for something. Ishtar is responsible for war, Enlil is responsible for thunderstorms, and I, Hammurabi, will be like a minor Anunnaki. I will be a minor deity of justice. They have a great god of justice. Hammurabi was considered one of his incarnations, roughly speaking, one of his forms. When you see the famous stele in the Louvre with the Code of Hammurabi, then everything is very clearly shown right here. Here you can see that Hammurabi receives from this, that is, these very laws that Hammurabi supposedly issued are ideologically justified by the fact that he personally received them from the God of justice. These laws, were not invented by your king, but by the God of justice himself. It is very important that he made justice a core part of his ideology, because on one of his steles it says that I, Hammurabi, the Lord of the Four Quarters, gathered all these formulas that had been invented before, all the developments on how to make people believe that you are their legitimate ruler. he kept them all for himself. He kept the titles, King of Akkad, King of Sumer, he kept it all. He is the Lord of the four quarters and a god and everything altogether. I have gathered the scattered lands, given the people fresh water, and given them the opportunity to work. This was considered very important, and the fact that he gives them laws too was, of course, a central point. Moreover, the bad god Enlil, who tried to drown people in the flood, why pray to him now? He is bad, he tried to drown people. I, as a good ruler, tell you stop praying to bad gods. There is the wonderful god Marduk, let's pray to him. And the cult of Marduk becomes practically monotheistic. Of course, everyone prays to different gods, but there is a clearly distinguished main god, Marduk, whose cult will remain the cult of the supreme deity until the disappearance of the entire Mesopotamian civilization. Marduk as the supreme deity. There were three categories of citizens in his laws. That is, there were free people and there were slaves. And there was an unclear category called wardom, but it is more often translated as royal people or something like that. That is, a wardom is like you're a free person, but you work on land that is not your own. This was this third category of people. But the main categories of people were probably the free and the slaves. And the law established that all people are different. Different rules and different laws apply to them. Furthermore, Hammurabi's laws are not even laws in the modern sense. They are more like 282 imperatives, which directly order something. These are not some legislative principles like in Roman law, for example. Rather, they are direct instructions. If your eye is gouged out, then the one who gouged it out must also have his eye gouged out. If your leg is injured, then the one who injured your leg must also have his leg injured. And this logic goes very far in these laws. For example, if a builder built a bad house and the house collapsed and killed the owner of the house, then the builder must be killed. If a builder built a bad house, the house collapsed and killed the owner's child, then the builder's child must be killed. Again, the Romans would have been very surprised by such an interpretation, because what did the child do, right? What does the child have to do with it? But this concept of personal responsibility or whatever else, it doesn't work here. In general, by our standards, this was probably strange. But for those people, it was, of course, the very embodiment of justice. Like, yes, absolutely. And this famous formula that you all know, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is actually a quote from the Code of Hammurabi. Also, what is probably very characteristic of this time is how they were applied. We do not know the case law, right? This is one of the problems of this era. We know the laws themselves, but we know very poorly, or rather, we probably don't know at all. It hasn't survived how they were implemented because apparently they didn't record court cases and how they proceeded. Therefore, unfortunately, we don't really know how sentences were handed down in actual courts based on such laws. Temples are great, but how were things with public, non-cult buildings? Public, non-cult buildings were mainly irrigation canals. This was the main thing, and everything was fine with that. They were dug in massive numbers, and they were all dug using a labor force assembled from slaves, from these wardom, royal people, and from conquered nations. Conquered peoples were subject to different rules. These laws were for those who lived according to the laws of Babylonia. But the conquered peoples were second-class citizens, and it was customary to treat them completely differently, because under Hammurabi, slightly different peoples begin to appear. It's not yet an empire like Assyria, which would unite many different peoples with a completely different approach to each. But it is precisely under Hammurabi that, for example, the concept of deporting populations appears. That is, when Hammurabi came to somewhere like Elam and saw the population there, the good lands in Elam were settled by Babylonians, while the Elamites themselves were deported from their good Elamite lands. They were forcibly resettled somewhere in bad lands, arid, windy, less fertile, and so on. So, what would become a massive practice under Assyria when entire nations would be resettled actually starts right under Hammurabi. In general, what's really characteristic of these laws is that they didn't overcomplicate things. I mean, they probably didn't have prisons or anything like that, so they didn't bother much with the measure of punishment. For almost everything, the punishment was simply death. Seriously. In this formula of if this crime happens, then that punishment follows, the outcome is very often death. It's just a standard penalty because, well, why not? For theft, any theft of anything, death. For the destruction or damage of a house and private property, like breaking a wall or a fence, death. If a son strikes his father, cut off his hand. The only time it wasn't death or mutilation was when it involved relations between slaves and free men, or royal people and free men. There, it varied. Usually, compensation had to be paid. For example, if a free man gouged out the eye of another free man, he had to lose his own eye. But if a free man gouged out the eye of a wardom, a royal person, then he just owed a certain number of shekels. They were already using shekels back then. It wasn't money as we know it, not coins, but a specific measure of silver. So he had to pay a shekel, and if the victim was a slave, then just 1/6 of a shekel or something like that. So the punishment definitely differed based on status. And then there are laws where it is completely unclear what is meant. For example, it literally says, for inappropriate behavior, death. But what is inappropriate behavior? How can you judge someone based on a law like that? Apparently, for the people of that time, this was a perfectly understandable formula. We can only fantasize about what it actually meant because, I repeat, we have absolutely no examples of real court cases. Oh, and by the way, if you accuse someone of a crime but couldn't prove it, death. It gets wilder. If a doctor treats a patient and cures them, you pay him a certain amount. The measure is strictly specified. But if a doctor performed an operation on you and made it worse, cut off his hand. Or imagine you are a merchant or a driver. Say you were hired as what we'd call a freight forwarder today. You are accompanying a donkey loaded with expensive fabrics to a neighboring city. If you get attacked on the road or you just lose the fabric, well, you are personally responsible for both the donkey and the goods. If the goods are lost, you must reimburse them from your own pocket. If you can't, you fall straight into debt slavery. So, yes, the laws are generally quite harsh. Well, not even quite harsh, they are absolutely brutal. But honestly, the vast majority of the laws aren't that interesting to us because most of them just describe money. On what grounds loans are given, how inheritance works, who gets what in what order, and endless rules about weddings, marriages, dowries, and so on. There's actually a law that if you divorce your wife, and yes, divorce did exist, you had to give her money. It was legally established that you had to compensate her somehow. So you actually had to pay her a certain amount. This was probably because women, generally speaking, didn't own property. But on the other hand, women did have legal rights, specifically married women. Once a woman was attached to a husband, she suddenly gained some very interesting rights. For example, she became an economic actor. This meant that in her husband's absence, she had the absolute right to make decisions on his behalf regarding the household and everything else. And this leads us to something amazing. We actually have their correspondence. Personal clay tablets, it's incredibly fascinating material, just everyday personal letters. It really answers the question, what were these people actually thinking about? From the Babylonian era, these personal letters on clay tablets are an absolute goldmine because, you study this stuff and you feel like, wow, this is such a mysterious, almost secretive civilization with all these incomprehensible gods and brutal laws. But then you read about their everyday household problems, and suddenly it's also incredibly relatable. Listen to this. A wife writes to her husband saying, "We're out of food at home, and the builders are still building something out here. I have nothing to pay them with, so I sold my dresses. When you get back, you owe me new ones." And she adds, "Oh, and by the way, you promised that we would have all this wealth. Where is it? You've been gone for 2 seasons now, and there's no wealth, and you aren't home either. Seriously, what is going on?" Instantly, you picture this very vivid, very human scene. You realize that, damn, people back then basically lived their lives exactly the same way we do now. Deep down, nothing really changed. At the same time, we actually have a lot of surviving texts about medicine, detailed descriptions of Babylonian medical practices. But you know what's really interesting? These descriptions didn't come from doctors. They were written by people who dealt with writing, meaning scribes or priests. So these people didn't actually practice medicine themselves. But so the king would know how it all worked, and just to keep a record of it, they wrote down these medical practices. You see, there were no manuals back then. Roughly speaking, they didn't have textbooks. There were only practical problems. And we actually have those practical math problems today. We're talking arithmetic, multiplication, even extracting square roots. That's what they actually knew how to do. Now, we haven't found any geometry problems, but they were definitely doing serious math. Also, we probably need to mention the Babylonian army again, because the Babylonian army is perhaps the first army in history where we actually know its core principle of formation through those military settlements we talked about. Oh, and we can also remember Herodotus. He wrote about Babylon too. But Herodotus, well, how should I put this? He fed us a bunch of absolute nonsense about Babylonia. Seriously, Herodotus tells this story that in Babylon, if someone got sick, they would just go to the town square and ask random passersby how to cure it. And if a passerby had the same illness, they'd give advice, and you'd supposedly treat yourself based on that. Well, Herodotus made that entirely up, straight out of his own head. Nothing like that happened in Babylon. People went to real doctors. The profession of a doctor absolutely existed, even though Herodotus claims it didn't. In reality, two different people treated illnesses, a priest and a doctor. Just because the doctor wasn't the only one treating you doesn't mean there were no doctors. You have to remember what era we are talking about here. Excuse me, this is 3,500 years ago. Just think about that. People's consciousness was still deeply magical. And so illnesses were explained by magic. This is even pre religious, before the big religions. It wasn't just religious consciousness, it was specifically deeply magical. So, pretty much the whole way through, it's all about amulets and incantations. And by the way, a huge amount of their literature is dedicated precisely to incantations and amulets, basically, how to protect yourself. It was believed that illnesses were demons. So, either a demon possessed you, or imagine you're sitting there shivering with a fever. You're thinking, man, I'm just sitting at my computer. The weather's fine, right? Why am I suddenly breaking into a cold sweat? What the hell? Maybe I caught a draft in the taxi. Or what? That's what you think. No, no, you didn't catch a draft in the taxi. In reality, you just can't see it. But standing right behind your shoulder is a demon whispering into your ear. Ushbamasta, alekashtama, rakatamba. And that's why you start shivering first. Then other symptoms hit. Your temperature spikes, your head starts pounding, and eventually you fall completely ill. So many diseases were seen as the direct machinations of a demon. And by the way, the worse you behaved, the higher your chances of aggroing a demon. The thing is, a demon isn't usually just assigned to you randomly. It's because, say, you cheated someone. A demon can practically smell it. It sniffs out, there's a liar around here somewhere, tracks you down, and then it starts doing all the stuff we just talked about. Very often, it starts whispering its curses onto you right after you've done something bad. So, in theory, ideally, if you never did anything wrong, you'd never get sick. But hey, we're all human, so it makes sense. What really amused me was their description of a headache. Listen to this. If your head hurts, it means a demon has taken your head in both its hands and is squeezing it. Now, that is a great description. That gets full marks. I can picture it perfectly. And honestly, sometimes it really feels exactly like that, especially if you drink too much coffee. It's like a demon named Nescafe just grabbed your head and is squeezing and squeezing. So, naturally, because of all this, a single doctor just isn't going to cut it. You absolutely need a priest who will come and perform rituals, very important rituals, and who will divine what's going to happen to you and whether it's even worth treating you. By the way, the doctor would only come if the priest said there was a point in treating you. For example, they absolutely did not treat strokes. We know this for a fact because there is a description that says if you have slurred speech, like difficulty speaking, and numbness in one half of your body or in your limbs, then you are going to die. And unfortunately, sorry, we can't help you with that. So, in this supposed textbook, well, we already explained it wasn't really a textbook, right? It stated that, well, sometimes that's just how it is. Incurable things exist. If your speech is slurred and a part of your body goes numb, then unfortunately, you are going to die. So, in cases like that, there was really no point in even calling a doctor. Yeah, a stroke, obviously. At the same time, it was incredibly important to understand omens. These were people who were completely obsessed with divination, and divination using animal intestines. Well, that was the absolute priority. Basically, the most important thing you could do was to smear yourself with blood, hang the intestines up like garlands on the walls, and boom, there's your altar. And we see that all their cults were kind of like that. Divination by animal innards basically looked exactly like it sounds. Unwind a ram, spin its intestines out, wrap them around yourself 3 times, look to the south, stare at the ram's brains, and so on. And there was a lot of this stuff. You have to wonder, how did they even wash it off afterward? Because, first of all, the unsanitary conditions must have been a nightmare. And secondly, well, these various rituals to drive away some dark, gloomy demon, they were pretty dark and gloomy themselves. Now, at this point in time, the clergy and the administrative power were separated. They were completely different things. A bureaucrat handles bureaucracy. A priest prays. But temples also owned land. By the way, this is actually quite similar to the Abrahamic religions we know today. The temple is a landowner, so priests were wealthy. They were probably considered a safe bet. But being a doctor back then, that had to be incredibly stressful. Just the simple fact that if you make a patient worse, they chop off your hand. And how often is the outcome completely out of the doctor's control? Again, this is highly characteristic of that era. It's probably a reflection of the fact that life in general was just hard. Just like all their laws were incredibly harsh, their divination and omens, almost all of them were extremely harsh too. For example, if a priest is walking to a patient's house and on the way he sees a black pig, boom, the patient will die. If he's walking and sees a regular pig, well, the patient won't die, but they'll suffer paralysis or something like that. If he's walking and the sun goes behind the clouds, death. If he's walking and the sun comes out from behind the clouds, severe pain. Honestly, sometimes you get the impression that the Babylonians didn't have any good omens at all. They actually did, but they were genuinely very rare. By the way, when doctors were working, they very often treated patients by giving them wine and beer as a medical treatment. They would literally just get the patient drunk on beer until they squealed like a pig. That was totally standard practice, probably hot beer too. Here, buddy, drink some hot beer. Maybe you'll feel better, or maybe you won't. But seriously, real doctors learned by example. You'd probably become an apprentice and learn from a senior doctor just by watching him work. However, you have to remember the texts that actually survived to our days were written by priests, not the doctors themselves. And you can often tell, especially with math problems, like calculating the construction of a temple or digging a canal. You can clearly see in their records when a priest actually knows what he's doing and when he's totally clueless. It is especially obvious in mathematics. By the way, if your teachers in school ever forced you to write out all the steps to solve a math problem, please remember that they were absolutely right. Because historians absolutely hate those ancient priests who didn't write out the solutions to their own problems. Their job was to make sure the king knew how a temple was built. So they get a practical problem, exactly how much volume of earth needs to be removed so that water flows into this canal. How much do we need to dig out? Sometimes on the clay tablets, you see a proper step-by-step breakdown, a normal human calculation of volume, but sometimes, boom, just the final answer. And it's obvious that you can't just calculate something like that in your head. So they probably just dug the canal, measured what they got, and wrote the final result as the answer. So yeah, they cheated back then too. There were definitely guys who just wrote down the final answer and couldn't be bothered to show their work or explain their thought process to anyone. There was a lot of that going on. And another thing, pay attention to this because it comes up in all sorts of movies and books. These guys actually knew astronomy really well. Moreover, they actively tracked eclipses. So if a movie or a book shows an eclipse starting and all the Babylonians get terrified, start trembling, faint, and cry out, "We will never fight again," because it happened so unexpectedly. Well, that's just the writers not knowing their history. They didn't just know about eclipses, they predicted them with totally accurate results. They could calculate exactly when an eclipse would happen, so they weren't terrified of the physical event itself. I mean, they were probably anxious about what the omen meant, but they weren't shocked by the fact that the sun went dark. And finally, let me remind you of the biggest mystery of all this. How are all these laws and rules actually applied? We have no idea. We've inherited a massive corpus from Babylon: mathematics, medicine, amazing literature, laws. A huge amount of stuff survived, but how any of it was actually put into practice? Nothing survived about that simply because they just didn't bother to write down how they actually applied it. Babylonia itself and the newly conquered Babylonia itself and the newly conquered territories. Out there in the conquered lands, completely different rules. Out there, they just oppress everyone, deport them, forcibly resettle them. Nobody even asks for their opinion. The laws simply didn't apply to those people. The laws were exclusively for the inhabitants of Babylonia proper. The locals, Akkadians, Sumerians, Amorites. Everyone else doesn't count. And naturally, by this era, and remember, we're looking at roughly 1700 BC, by this time, the Sumerian language was completely dead. That's it, gone. Only dialects of the Akkadian language were used. Akkadian had completely pushed it out, and the Sumerians themselves were entirely assimilated by this point. We literally stop seeing Sumerian names. All names become Akkadian, and so on. It is the absolute domination of Akkadian culture. Now, in principle, this dynasty would actually last a pretty long time. The thing is, you can't even say that this Babylonian state just fell apart on its own, because while all previous attempts to build a massive, sprawling state had failed, mostly because states were just too weak back then, this time was different. Thanks not only to Hammurabi, but to the entire Amorite dynasty, the state held together really well. It survived for another 250 years after Hammurabi himself. And it lived quite perfectly. No worries. Well, okay, not exactly no worries, but it survived long enough to get hit by a few major things. First of all, climate change. Specifically, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers changed their courses. And because of this, the capital city of Babylon itself was destroyed. It got hit really hard. Actually, wait, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. First, the obvious thing happened, the thing that always happens. They suffered heavily from raids by various Amorites and other Semitic tribes. But that was just business as usual. The most important thing Babylon missed was the rise and development of the Hittite state. Over in Anatolia, what is probably the very first iron civilization appears, the Hittites. And at some point, they just came in and destroyed a multitude of cities. They destroyed Babylon itself, and then they just left. These were crushing defeats in the war with the Hittites. And after the Hittites destroyed a whole series of cities here, including the capital itself, the Hurrian nomads invaded. Up in the north, the state of Mitanni appears. So basically, this great Babylon, which had been so glorious, could they notice that it doesn't just shatter back into individual city-states anymore. This idea of a vast, continuous state, which took a long, hard time to build century after century, on the third attempt, it actually prevails. Even after the inevitable collapse of the state, because it is inevitable. Nothing lasts forever. I mean, how long can we go? 200, 300, 400 years. No state lasts forever. Someday, every single state that exists today will vanish from the world map. There will be no USA, no France, no Russia, no Ukraine, no Angola, no India, no China. None of it will exist. There will be something else someday. And it was the same back then. While you are living in a specific era, it feels infinite, but even Babylonia ends up splitting into two states, because even the barbarians who tore it apart, the Kassites and the Hurrians, they still divided it into two distinct states. Granted, these states would be quite weak. Now, the state of Mitanni did actually amount to something. They became a serious rival to the Hittites and a serious rival to Egypt. But still, the actual center of civilization shifted. For a while, for a few centuries, the center of the world moves out of Mesopotamia and heads towards the Hittites. The Hittites were just so hardcore that they completely pulled the center of influence towards themselves. There simply wasn't a power left in Mesopotamia strong enough to rally the region around it, because the Hittites were pushing deep all the way to Aleppo, down to Ugarit, and all the way to Kadesh. And take note, right around this time, we have the Amarna period happening over in Egypt. And don't forget, we are building up to the epic battle of Kadesh between the Hittites and the Egyptians. So now they are the main powers. They expand so much that they step out of their own regions and they start laying serious claims to Mesopotamia. It gets to the point where local vassals in some cities start scrambling and writing letters like, "No, no, we're actually with the Hittites," or "Wait, no, we're with the Egyptians." And the locals just have to adapt and submit somehow. But underneath it all, even as the region fades into the background at the end of the Bronze Age, the clock is ticking. The Bronze Age collapse is fast approaching. We're talking severe climate disruptions, massive cataclysms, huge migrations on the scale of the Great Migration of Nations, and, of course, the arrival of the mysterious Sea Peoples, who absolutely obliterate the Creto-Mycenaean civilization. Now, that's still about 100 or 200 years away. Right now, they have no idea about the phenomenon we call the Bronze Age collapse, the total disintegration of the late Bronze Age civilization across the entire region, Egypt, the Hittites, everyone. They don't know it yet, but a total collapse is coming for all of them. And on the entire map, there is exactly one state that will survive all of this and rise like a phoenix from the ashes. That state is Assyria. Going into the Iron Age, Assyria will become the very first multinational, as we would call it today, empire in history. The first true empire, complete with imperial roads and strict imperial laws. But we'll talk about that next time. For today, we are wrapping up Bronze Age Mesopotamia. Bye, everyone.